Modern pop punk has more delicious flavors than your local Baskin Robbins, but unfortunately, it also suffers from a very serious, seemingly unfixable problem. The stigma. Just the words pop punk are enough to send shivers down your spine. The negative connotations that the term carries at the moment make it extra hard for anybody interested in the genre to share that interest with the other people in their lives. Today I want to take a look at what the pop punk stigma is, what a few of the contributing factors to it are, and if any of the modern bands of the 2020s have what it takes to shake the stigma and call for a paradigm shift. Yo, what's up? The name's Dan Frampton and I'm all about DIY underground music over on this channel. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about pop punk, and more specifically, the stigma that surrounds it. There's a dark cloud that surrounds the genre that has only gotten more gray and gloomy in time. For all the ugly, icky stuff found within the walls of pop punk, there is also a sliver of hope. I'm just wondering if anybody has the answer to pop punk's unfixable problem. Chapter 1. The unfixable problem. The stigma is the problem, and describing it is not the hard part of the story. The stigma is actually very simple. I'll sum it up for you real quick like this. Pop punk sucks. People hate it. They associate pop punk with whiny grown men singing about a high school breakup that they're still not over well into their 40s. Pop punk is also, for some people, a synonym for, let's say, someone who's not allowed near school zones. And that's just what everyday, average, normal people would think. If we cross the divide to the DIY side of things for a little bit, we'll see that the punk world sees pop punkers as just a bunch of corporate shills who are more than eager to sell out. It really does seem like a lose-lose type situation to enjoy and or play pop punk music in the modern era. Some artists are better than others. It's like that in every single medium. But no matter how good any of the pop punk artists are, they will have to find a way to overcome the stigma and make it work for themselves. Before we see how the modern bands are handling these rough waters out there, we really should define what those rough waters are to begin with. It can basically be summed up with what I'm calling the 2 C's: crimes and cringe. The bands and the artists of the 2000s fell into either one of these two categories. If you weren't a criminal with at least a dozen allegations, you were at least a stunted, immature, cringy little man-child. I don't want to get into all the specific artists and all the allegations in this video. Those videos are out there if you want them. The artists themselves were only a fraction of what caused the stigma. And these artists were only going so ham because of the industry around them that celebrated and encouraged degeneracy. Warped Tour, in retrospect, absorbs a lot of the heat here, and rightfully so. It is the perfect umbrella example to capture and magnify the issue with pop punk. All the disgusting pop punk happened on the Warped Tour, and it really is a shame it went down the way that it did. The Warped Tour started out so sick, bro. There was so much potential at first. It was just a way to get together and enjoy punk rock music and skateboarding with other aficionados of the subculture. When festival founder Kevin Lyman got the Vans sponsorship, it really kicked things into overdrive. The Vans Warped Tour would become a sort of traveling punk rock and skateboarding carnival type thing through the late 90s and early 2000s. It would be a cultural epicenter for alternative and punk rock subcultures of the time. But over time, the vibes went from immaculate to sinister. As we moved into the 2010s, the glory days of the fest being a punk rock mecca were long gone. Kevin Lyman would learn about the artists being the worst kind of gross only to allow them back on the fest the next year. The lawless nature of the Warped Tour really started to feel literally warped. Once the true colors came out about all the nefarious behaviors being allowed to occur on the fest, the stigma had all the appropriate elemental conditions to thrive. If the Warped Tour itself wasn't 100% responsible for driving the final nail into the pop-punk coffin, then I can honestly say that I believe MGK, with the help of Travis Barker, are. Not with Crimes this time, just cringe. So much cringe, bro. In 2018, Machine Gun Kelly got so embarrassed in a diss track rap beef with Eminem that he had to switch genres entirely. This lined up perfectly with Travis Barker starting his own record label, DTA Records. MGK wasn't signed to DTA or anything like that. Travis was just looking to be involved in everything pop-punk related during the end of the 2010s. It was like he wanted to be credited as the king and ultimate tastemaker of the genre. This was before Tom rejoined Blink, so Travis was all in on this new endeavor. He was shoving so much down our throats at the time, you'd swear he forgot how toilets worked. After MGK disappeared for a while following the Eminem debacle, he came back to debut his new pop-punk style to the world. An album with Travis Barker playing drums on all the tracks called Tickets to My Downfall would be released in 2020. When I say this album is an embarrassment, I mean it. And that word doesn't even paint half the picture of how bad it actually is. But according to MGK himself, ladies and gentlemen, the new face of pop punk has officially arrived. Jesus, have mercy, it should have ended there. Dear God, why didn't it end there? Why was this man allowed to make a second pop-punk record? 2 years later, in 2022, he dropped the even stinkier pile of horse dung, Mainstream Sellout. There are so many reasons why people hated this album. The songs Sid and Nancy and Emo Girl paint MGK as toxic and problematic at best, or an abusive predator at worst. I have no idea why he would even write these songs to begin with. And all of these awful songs would just get buried under Travis Barker's awful mix. Yeah, that's right. Travis Barker was the primary producer on this thing. Bad choice. If the DIY scene is ever going to fully embrace pop punk again, it has an uphill battle working against it. Warped Tour, MGK, and Travis Barker were not the only contributing factors to the stigma, of course. The generic and predictable songs created by literally thousands of bands over the course of 3 decades, I'm sure had something to do with it too. Chapter 2, the many flavors of modern pop punk. Listen, breaking the stigma is still not something that has occurred. The stigma is still going strong out there on the streets today. With that being said though, the world of pop punk in the underground is more varied and creative than it's ever been. The stigma is whatever though. I'm not too interested in the stigma. What I'm interested in is the band's reactions to the stigma. It shows me that everybody is out there trying to fix the unfixable problem. The first and most obvious reaction to the stigma is to distance yourself from it. At first, this might seem like the best approach, but what ends up happening is you go so far in the other direction that you basically just end up back where you started from. An artist like NASCAR Aloe can be looked at like a distance guy. His stuff doesn't sound pop punk at all. But when I see this dude, I can't help but think he took one look at Mod Sun and was like, I'm the opposite of whatever that guy is. His stuff gets so abrasive and wild sometimes that it can almost feel like a cartoonish parody of itself, which is what I mean by going too far in the other direction. I can appreciate his vision, and I definitely f*** with a couple of his bops. The opposite of distancing yourself from the stigma, naturally, is to embrace it. I find this to be by far the most interesting route to go. Bands that go down this road don't seem to be ignoring all the cringe that came before it. In fact, it's the other way around. They're leaning into it, so I'm gonna call these bands lean bands for the sake of this video. It's like these lean bands are saying, yeah, stigma, I know you exist, bro. Smell my finger. The band that comes to my mind immediately when I think of lean bands is a band called Scooped Up. Scooped up, scooped up, scooped up, scooped up, scooped up. When I say these dudes lean, they damn near tip all the way over. We're talking puka shell necklaces. We're talking 3/4 turned backwards trucker hats. We're talking dickies and poop jokes. Scooped Up has chosen that their best option is the nuclear one. The next band that'll whiz by this little cranium is a little Ramones core band called Mean Jeans. All Ramones core bands are leaners, but Mean Jeans lean like no other. Fast, catchy, fun, exactly like the Ramones. Not similar to, not derived from, exactly the Ramones, and it rules so hard. If you're looking for a fresh take on the Ramones sound, you're not getting it here. But if you are on the hunt for some third wave ska, look no further than Jer. I learned about Jer through their YouTube channel Ska2 Network like 5 years ago, where they were uploading ska covers. Their charisma is instantly magnetic, making for a very easy follow. Ever since then, they've been hitting the road and making a mad name for themselves. The next group of bands I'm going to call Twisters because of how they twist the stigma into a little pretzel and make it call out its safe word. This reaction to the stigma might have the highest likelihood in breaking it. A band like Tulsa, Oklahoma's Cliff Diver keep moving the goalpost of what's possible within the pop punk parameters. They have bouncy songs like Days Gone. Then they also have a song like Oh Bondage Up Yours, which is a pissed off hardcore banger with a saxophone that goes harder than JR off of 5 Blue Chews. The next Twister artist you need to be made aware of is an artist known as Eichlers. They take the glitchy, hyperpop vibes, lace it with a little bit of late 2010s bedroom pop aesthetic, and put it all over top of a bed of pop punk rhythms. They just put out a full length called Ike World that assembles these sounds into a twinkly, glitchy, bittersweet little batch of songs.
You know I drive you crazy. You know I got it, baby. You know I.
And then we got Make War. Make War doesn't only make war, they also make pop punk music. They just put out a fantastic record called A Paradoxical Theory of Change. And you know how much I love a good paradoxical theory over here on the channel. What makes Make War cool is that they take familiar pop punk structures and ideas and just make it a little gruffer. They age it up a bit, which is nice. Because they're old. They kind of remind me of Hot Water Music in that way, to be honest, but they have a little bit more of a post-punk type edge to them. Chapter 3. Parker Cannon has his cake and eats it too. There is no figure in pop punk quite like Parker Cannon. He's an anomaly of preposterous proportions. A guy like this shouldn't be allowed to exist. On one hand, he proves the stigma to be strong and true, while on the other hand, he successfully obscures and obfuscates it. He's an enigma who gainfully fronts and operates 2 pop punk bands at the moment who have 2 vastly different fan bases. One of these fan bases disrespects the other one so hard that it takes a certain level of charisma and clout to pull off what Parker is currently pulling off. Let me explain. One of the bands he fronts is a big money stigma band called The Story So Far. Some people might get mad at that assessment and would argue that The Story So Far is not a stigma band at all. They would classify them more as a revival band. But guess what? The stigma is all over the 2010s revival stuff too. Look no further than Neck Deep to get an example of what I'm talking about here. Again, this video isn't for allegations, arrests, charges, or details, but just know that Neck Deep fall into the crimes category of the 2 C's. My issue with The Story So Far is the other C, cringe. Parker has grown a lot over the years, but the lyrics he presents with this band are enough to get slapped with a C. The other band he sings for flies directly into that band's face, and it's called No Pressure. No Pressure play mostly no barricade hardcore shows with tons of stage diving and moshing. Using the reaction types from the previous chapter, I would call No Pressure a lean band because of how hard they lean into the early Blink vibe. The hardcore world shouldn't love them as much as they do, but they do. What's even crazier though is that this hardcore crowd typically disavows everything that The Story So Far stands for. Normally they'd see a guy like Parker as a corporate representative of the establishment, but they don't. They see him as a true and proper G. Parker Cannon seems to be getting away with something that most other pop-punk vocalists could not in a million years. Let's say if Pete Wentz, for example, started another pop-punk band to play hardcore shows, I don't think it would go quite as well. Stigma-related topics will always be brought up when discussing his work, but we're getting closer. I can almost smell it. Chapter 4. Koyo gets anxious. Okay, so now pop punk has been reintroduced to the hardcore meta or whatever. But the doors of the gate aren't just gonna swing open for any old Tom, Mark, or Travis. If you're starting a band and your intention is to be bringing pop punk through the sacred halls of hardcore, you must be ready to face some harsh, brutal truths. You'll have to work 100 times as hard to get half the reaction of the other bands on the bill. If you're a pop punk band in hardcore, you're basically a women's wrestler. You're technically better than the main event, you do crazier stuff than the main event, but ultimately you will seldomly be found in the main event. If that truth isn't enough of a deterrent for you, maybe the political side will put the fear of Marauder in you. It's not really that scary, actually. You just basically have to be a hardcore person to begin with. Like, you just go to hardcore shows and stuff. You hang out with other hardcore folk. If people think you're cool, they might book your band if you're show ready. I would say bands like Military Gun and Fleshwater encapsulate this perfectly, but they're definitely not pop punk bands, so we're not going to be talking about them right now. Where things start to get a little bit more pop punk is with a band called Anxious. Anxious takes that preppy Connecticut hardcore energy and mixes it with a little bit of progressive flair. They bring emo and hardcore to the table in such fascinating ways when crafting their songs. Their songwriting and stage presence is almost unrivaled. Almost. Another northeastern band is getting away with playing emo-adjacent pop-punk to hardcore crowds. You know them, you love them. Ladies and gentlemen, I give to you the world's most confusing band, Koyo. I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. Koyo might actually be the closest to breaking the stigma that we've seen so far in this video. The insane thing about this band is that if I'm making an emo video, I could talk about them. If I'm making a hardcore video, boom, Koyo. But this is the pop punk video, and here we are talking about Koyo. Very confusing. I'll borrow a line from Joe Hardcore here. They look like a bunch of dudes who pour cement. They're burly ass just bopping around to songs about their feelings. There might be a paradox going on within Koyo itself. It's incredible that these lunatics even exist to begin with. If a band like this broke through and made knock loose levels of noise online, I could see the stigma budging a little bit. Chapter 5, and let there be justice for all. Justice Tripp, that is. This fella could very well be the solution to this stigma. I almost believe he, and someone else I'll talk about soon, can be the tide that turns to create the ripple needed to shift the entire paradigm. Justice Tripp is a frontman's frontman. He's got an insane haircut. He wears wild sunglasses. He's got a mouth full of grills. He possesses riz so ridiculous that he could take your mom and your sister on a date at the same time. I'm joking, obviously, but let's take a look at what makes this goofball so special. I learned of Justice and his ballistic Baltimore brethren when most other people did. In the late 2000s / early 2010s, when his hardcore band Trapped Under Ice started to really disrupt the space. The drummer of this band, Brendan Yates, would go on to form a little band called Turnstile. Maybe you heard of them. But at this time, Trapped Under Ice quickly became known as the freshest new hardcore band. It's not that they necessarily put Baltimore on the map, but I can't say that they hurt the city's reputation either. But I hear you typing, Dan, why are you talking about hardcore again? I thought that this was a pop punk video. Well, I can answer that question. It's actually pretty easy, and that would be Justice's next band, Angel Dust.
We're Angel Dust. Pull up.
Pull up. Do it.
After Brendan's side project took off, there were of course fill-ins on drums for Trapped Under Ice, but ultimately it would lead to Justice branching out to start this new project. Calling Angel Dust pop punk is a little dismissive because of how creative they are, sure, but there is no doubt that the music is punk in nature, catchy, and littered with memorable melodies and hooks. That's pop punk. Angel Dust is a twist of a twister band, and they happen to be fronted by an interesting, captivating frontman. That's why I think they have all the tools necessary to alter the public's opinion of what pop punk is or can be. They have both feet firmly planted in the underground and will always be accepted there. Plus, they are much more accessible to wider audiences than the bands that they typically play with. They very well could be the missing link. But there is only one man that I believe to be civilization's last gasp at answering pop punk's unfixable problem. Chapter 6, The Fixer. Jeff Rosenstock has by far the best reaction to the stigma that I've seen. He somehow manages to ignore it. What separates Jeff from his peers is his songwriting. He has an ability to relay his own personal struggles in a way that feels relatable to everyone out there on planet Earth being faced with the human experience. It doesn't hurt that he also happens to seem like a human being himself. Wild, I know, right? There is nothing extra tacked on to his process or presentation. It's Jeff Rosenstock. Jeff brings a level of authenticity to the genre that I have never encountered before. There are guys out there like Frank Turner who you could make an argument for here, but Jeff Rosenstock's ability to strike a nerve with his words and punchy songs hit like no other in my opinion. Unlike the other bands so far, Jeff doesn't come from the hardcore scene at all. Jeff came up a ska guy. He was in bands like Bomb the Music Industry and the Arrogant Sons of Bitches. That basically means that not only is Jeff faced with the pop punk stigma, he's also got to overcome ska slander. How is one man capable of surmounting such odds? This is the part of the video where I go through Jeff's 6 main albums to show you how he's fixing modern pop punk's unfixable problem. Accidentally, by ignoring it. Jeff's first full length is called I Look Like Shit, and it rules. We see Jeff throwing a lot of stuff at the wall on this 2012 lo-fi debut LP as kind of a spiritual vision quest. This record is fuzzy and rough around every single corner. Going through this process, however, would give Jeff what he needed to purposefully craft the fire that was to come next. His singing would go on to see much better days too. I'll tell you that much for free. In 2015, Jeff hit us with his next full-length entitled, We Cool? This album opens up with a song that tricks us into thinking we're about to get a folk punk record, but then once it kicks in, it basically rips a hole in the space-time continuum. Where most pop punkers are tempted to write about the teenage experience, Jeff is smarter than that and hits us with all the moments of realization that come along with getting older. Not to mention, most of the people that grew up on pop punk are getting older now as well. They're all reflecting on the same things that Jeff is. Jeff just so happens to be singing about it. He accidentally did the right thing at the right time just by expressing himself authentically. He's unapologetically honest on this thing, displaying a level of vulnerability that usually hides behind a veil of fear with most other pop punk penmen. Bringing in acclaimed producer Jack Shirley to twist knobs and push buttons for this project is the glue that would go on to tie together Jeff's overall sound going forward. As personal and as blistering as this album is, it would only get better creatively for Jeff from here. 2016's album Worry subverts expectation by opening with a subdued piano accompanied by Jeff's soft, reflective vocals. That's the first flip on the genre, and we're presented with it immediately. The layers of other instruments like guitar and saxophone start to swell in on the opening track, We Beg to Explode, as Jeff laments about him and his friends growing up, starting families, and all the woes found therein. Fall in love and get married. Isn't that like crazy? The working, having babies and promotions. the cheating, lying, leaving, and divorcing. Lines like that really bring the listener directly into the head and heart of the author. Oh, I may accidentally refer to Jeff as an author in this thing because of the way that Jeff accidentally elevates the writing found in pop punk. The opening song builds up to a cathartic burst as it snaps into its full rock and roll instrumentation. The vocal refrain of Jeff singing "All These Magic Moments I've Forgotten" really drives home the somber themes we're about to experience on this pop punk album called Worry, for Christ's sake. Jeff Rosenstock is on a creative island of his own, and it's apparent before we even tear the band-aid off of this thing. The record goes on to accidentally rip asses to shreds. Jeff's vocals are getting a little bit more pissed off, and his writing is starting to dig even deeper to give us a little bit more detail and description. His tasteful use of sax to add subtle little flourishes is beautiful and extremely effective in conveying emotion and establishing a unique sound signature. Jeff isn't afraid to speak his mind about politics either. He doesn't shy away from telling us that the internet and our phones are negatively affecting us. He was one of the many warning us of the impending dangers of the brain rot to come. But it's here that I can tell that life is starting to wear on our boy Jeff. In 2018, on his album Post, we're immediately greeted with the lyrics, "Dumbfounded, downtrodden, and dejected." So I'm guessing Jeff is still feeling pretty rough here. I can feel how exhausted he is. The refrain he uses to set the thematic mood this time is, "We're tired and bored." We're seeing Jeff at his most helpless and hopeless. There does seem to be a glimmer of hope in his eyes that may suggest he's interested in the healing process. He remains reluctant because he knows how much work that it will be. He's desperate but too anxious and terrified to do anything about it. The album is a dark vacuum of bleak despair. If you've ever been there emotionally in your own life, he hits upon all the common tropes and copes we tell ourselves that inevitably keep the depression around. If you've never hit your rock bottom, this album is almost a cautionary tale to keep taking care of your mental health before it all falls apart. Because it can crumble so fast, and the work that it takes to build it all back up is painful and relentless. 9 times out of 10 is one of the saddest songs I have ever heard. Jeff is not getting better on this album. We're now starting to understand how much he's got going on. He places himself in situations that are familiar to the listener and then goes on to illustrate how he feels from there. This method of expressing emotion and telling stories puts us right there with him. It's an effective writing technique. Sad, but very effective. The record closes with the refrain, "We're not gonna let them win again." No. He's defiant and willing to fight for his happiness, folks. He ain't there yet though, but let the battle begin. A 5-minute blissful string section concludes the record with hope and peace. And then comes No Dream in 2020. This would be the first album I would show a pop punk casual fan, give them an example of what a pop punk record sans stigma sounds like. Don't get me wrong, I dig a vast selection of stigma bands, but what Jeff is doing on this record is enough to sway anyone to this side of pop punk. They'd probably think something like, oh, this is possible in pop punk? The song like Nikes demonstrates this point excellently. In this song, Jeff tells us that he's doing good with his mental health work, but he still has some vices that he knows are a little bit toxic. The one being described in this song is his affinity for Nike sneakers. He describes it as status symbol that I say I'm above, and goes on to call himself a stinking rich hypocrite. He uses another refrain to expertly paint the emotional picture of what that means. At the end of the song about being addicted to sneakers, he repeats the lines, "It's not going to bring no happiness," and "There's no vacant bliss," over and over. I think using consumer culture to express this emotion is a next level move. It reveals something personal about the artist while simultaneously relating to everyday, average people in a non-threatening, super approachable kind of way. This is Jeff's most accessible work up until this point by a long shot. It's catchy, fun, and colorful, all the while exploring all the familiar dark themes we've heard him explore before. It's like a switch was flipped in his head creatively on this record, like a serious aha moment or come to Jesus event had occurred that catapulted Jeff from off the island he was on into the stratosphere and formed him into a planet of his own. Jeff is a celestial body on this record. He's got suns and moons and everything. I can hear clarity in his words where there was once nothing but pessimism, confusion, and frustration. The first time I heard this album, I couldn't wrap my mind around it. I didn't know what I was hearing. I'm still impressed with how Jeff and his team managed to put a record like this together. If you told me back then that this was going to be his creative peak, I would have believed you. That's how dense and complex this album is. But that's not the case. Things would become even more fine-tuned the farther along the healing process he was. An artist like MGK toxically glorifies his sadness for his art. Jeff is proving that there is more power in confronting your sadness and healing than there is in rolling around in it to suit your own vanity. He would re-record No Dream and release the same batch of songs, but this time as a ska project called Ska Dream. It's so insane to hear these amazing songs reimagined in this rude boy way. Then 2023 happened and Jeff Rosenstock would drop a bona fide masterpiece. After putting out a record like No Dream, the next album he would release would obviously be highly anticipated by fans and critics alike. At the end of August of that year, Hell Mode would drop, and somehow it creatively eclipsed all of his previous work. Yes, even the sacred No Dream. The record opens up with another brilliant refrain that gives us the theme that will narratively tie these tracks together. In the opening song, Will You Still You, Jeff sings, "Will you still love me after I fuck up?" And, "'cause growing and changing doesn't change that stuff." This shows us that Jeff is at a point in his healing process where he realizes that there are some things that you simply cannot change. A certain level of patience and understanding is required by the people in his life, and he's aware that that can be a pretty big ask. That's exactly why it's the first and most immediately pressing question that the album asks. On this album, we're hearing a wise Jeff Rosenstock for the first time. We're hearing from a man who has seen some shit and has learned many lessons from it. This isn't a broken, beaten down, battered old man like it could have very well been if he let it. It's not all rainbows now, of course not. But this vision of happiness is viewed through a lens of reality, and he isn't afraid to admit that some things will always suck. He has such clever ways of expressing the thoughts and feelings you have as you go through a lifetime of these kinds of realizations. Things you used to find annoying, you can now find peace in. When someone causes pain, it's okay to push them away is one of the most emotionally in-tune things I've ever heard in a song. And it's so cool to go through this process with him as he puts out albums. We can hear the growth emotionally and sonically happening simultaneously. And it's honestly nothing short of astounding. His approach to pop punk lives beyond the stigma in a realm of its own. Chapter 7, a conclusion to my analysis. Jeff Rosenstock has everything that it takes to tip the scales of the stigma. His depth and vulnerability alongside Justice Tripp's cool factor could be exactly what the mainstream needs to see in its current state to understand what pop punk can be. The only reason the scale hasn't tipped is because each respective artist has too much integrity to sell out. They're fine with the stigma running wild on the surface because what they have carved out for themselves in the underground is not only sustainable, but it's also gotta be creatively fulfilling. It would be cringe and feel like a crime to mess with something that works. Okay, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button, and until my next upload, watch another upload.